In this presentation, we're going to be taking a look at the environmental movement and all the different forms that it's taken over the years. Our discussion of the environmental movement is going to look at three different waves, beginning with the first wave of the late 19th century, based largely on the views of the Romantics and their notions of wilderness to a large degree. They didn't really talk about the environment the way we do today. It's not really the way they used that term. It was really concern for nature and wilderness, and that gave rise to a conservation movement. In the 1950s and 70s, what we think of as the modern environmental movement sprang into existence, largely built around a number of disasters, such as the dumping of mercury in Minamata Bay in Japan, and culminating in Earth Day of 1970. And 1990s saw a third wave where social justice and environmental concerns created a confluence to become an environmental justice movement, and that was later kind of folded into the sustainability movement, as sustainability came to also include concepts of social justice. It was during the first wave, the conservation movement, when the nation saw a number of important organizations emerge, such as the Sierra Club, the Audubon Society, and within the government, the U.S. Forest Service and the National Park Service were created. And these really came on the heels of some other state-level policy reforms, such as the 1864 Congressional Act of moving Yosemite Valley and Mariposa Redwood Grove to California for public use. And these would later become a national park, right? In 1872, the first official national park was created, and that was Yellowstone. And it was not just for natural resources, which was a common way of looking at nature during this time, but it was for protection, for science and recreation. And that mission remains built into the National Park Service's mission today. But beyond the influence of the Romantics were the utilitarians, perhaps embodied by figures such as Gifford Pinchot, who is often juxtaposed against John Muir, who is the embodiment of Romanticism for many. And we see additional important policy reforms that fall within the utilitarian view, such as the 1891 Forest Reserve Act and the 1897 Forest Management Act. And of course, the government has remained committed to viewing trees largely as resources as protected under the U.S. Forest Service, which is a part of the Department of Agriculture. So that should tell you kind of the overarching framework that forests are often viewed as crops. And by 1909, so much action had taken place at the federal level. There were 159 national forests covering 150 million acres of land and 46 million acres in forest reserves. And what's unique about this first wave of the environmental movement, which is the conservation movement, is that it did not really involve the public. It was not initiated by the public. It was a top-down movement, a series of policies that were created based on the prodding of powerful politicians such as Theodore Roosevelt, who as president really enjoyed hunting and going into nature, and was largely creating a playground for elites by protecting just millions of acres of wilderness. So no public input, lots of top-down and decision making, and the management of these resources, this land, was built on utilitarian principles to a large degree, where we're going to be protecting the forest resources. And it was run in a technical assistance sort of way where the experts are in charge, and this assumes a lot of trust and expert knowledge. There were some limitations with this first wave. For one, social justice issues, what will be encompassed in environmental justice, were not at all considered. In fact, it was, as we said, a highly elitist kind of movement, series of proposals to create a playground for hunting and so forth. The public was not involved, and they were led to believe that the experts were now managing wilderness and the environment. And because really this, these reforms were really to protect wilderness areas, they didn't really address concerns that were aimed at the environmental problems of everyday people. So they weren't looking to protect your backyard so much as these kind of set aside wilderness areas. And a number of tragic events, such as the Dust Bowl, which was based on over-farming and loss of soil fertility, led to broader concern about the environment in general and not just these pristine wilderness areas. And if we look at the primary tactics used in the first wave, the conservation movement, we see that to a large degree the methods were structural, really just policies and laws that were enacted by powerful politicians. There was very little public involvement, so there was little public buy-in to what these policies had to offer. No cognitive component to this. And conservation focus, as we said, is limited to pristine areas and did not cover broader environmental issues. The second wave of the environmental movement is really sort of what we think of when we hear about environmental movement, beginning in the 1950s, although most people associate it with later times of the 60s and 70s, kind of in conjunction with other movements such as women's rights, civil rights, and the rise of the hippie movement and so forth. The 1950s were really the beginning of that. That's where we saw enactment of the Wilderness Act. Concern for exotic species was peaking, for instance. And by the 60s, the writings of Rachel Carson, Paul Ehrlich, and Barry Commoner were starting to shape public opinion, and concern for the impacts of modern science and chemistry, Carson writing about pesticides, and also concern about population, as discussed by Ehrlich, and also concern about modern technologies, as was the focus of Commoner's work. And these were instrumental in getting people concerned. There were several different origins that gave rise to the environmental movement, and we can talk about them on a macro, meso, and micro level. At the macro level, there was a broader range of environmental, as we said, tragic events that were starting to raise concern, and many of those starting as early as the 1930s. But culminating in this movement, there was an increasing awareness of the limits of capitalism as people came to view the modern technologies created by capitalism as being problematic. And people's values began to change. Culturally, there was a shift to this kind of post-materialism as really embodied by the hippie movement. There were new technological changes, as we mentioned, demographic changes, such as the baby boom, and occupational shifts away from manufacturing. At the meso level, the focus and the organizational resources, political opportunity, there was money going to environmental social movement organizations. So with people, lots of people and lots of money, everything, all the pieces were in the right place, and this movement could get off the ground. And there was just a lot of really educated people, as more and more people were going to college, studying ecological systems and biology, and social scientists were starting to get involved. And at the micro level, there's a greater understanding of how individuals were coming to frame environmental problems. The social psychology of environmental concern was in a nascent state. The issues became problematized, greater media attention to such issues as toxic waste, and the nation watched as Love Canal was declared an emergency, for instance. And more people began to embrace the writings of such authors as Rachel Carson. So the modern environmental movement of the 50s began to really be a culmination of several macro, meso, and micro level factors, broad structural shifts, the availability of immense resources to fund movement organizations, there was political opportunity as those at the top were receptive to what the grassroots movements were saying, and there were widespread grievances in society about environmental problems. And so situations began to be redefined as problematic, whereas perhaps smokestacks were viewed as a sign of progress, they were now viewed as something else, as a problem to be solved. But the modern environmental movement was largely criticized for being a middle-class white social movement. And really this built on the first wave, which was not just middle-class white, but upper-class white men in particular, of wealth and status. And so the environmental justice movement, which really started to gain a footing in the 1990s, began to involve minority groups, women, and broader social justice equity concerns. And environmental justice has focused not on wilderness areas as much as on people's neighborhoods, where you live, and the focus is less on exotic species and protecting them, and it's more on protecting people. So it's more human-oriented, human-focused, although not to the exclusion of perhaps protecting wilderness. But the real emphasis here is on making sure people have clean air, land, and water, and that there's not a gross inequality from one neighborhood to the next. So social equity is the defining feature of this third wave of environmental justice. And so we're going to focus a little more closely on this because while people have some passing understanding of the environmental movement, they tend to know less about environmental justice. And the key questions of environmental justice are who gets what, when, and the real important one is where and how. So, of course, the idea of environmental injustice is that those with more advantage, those who have more advantaged social heritage, tend to be less likely to experience threatening environmental conditions. And we can talk about this concept of the environment as our sort of what's going on inside of our bodies, our health. And the other side of the coin, those with less advantages bear the brunt of environmental bads, right? So they don't really have access to the environmental goods, such as wilderness areas and parks and those kinds of things, but they have lots of bads in terms of toxic wastes that accumulate in the body through eating pesticide-laden foods and breathing in contaminated air and so forth. The environmental justice movement started as a movement in the United States in the 1990s, and it was largely an extension of the civil rights movement, but now considering environmental threats to minority groups in particular, and became a civil rights issue through an executive order passed by Bill Clinton, which requires federal agencies to consider environmental justice concerns before taking any action. And now the movement has, of course, gone global. And but the United States origins of this really started in Warren County, North Carolina, where there was a standoff. In the state of North Carolina, a trucking company was dumping PCB all over along the highways as a way to just get rid of this material. And the state became aware of it and had to clean it up. So they had to literally go through and scrape up 30,000 gallons of PCB-laced oil and land along the highways. And so these truckloads of contaminated soil had to dump the stuff somewhere. And what they decided was this primarily African American and one of the poorest counties in North Carolina would be a good place to dump it. And rather than finding a passive community when these trucks arrived with this PCB-laden soil, they found protesters with signs, and this indeed captured a national imagination. The soil was dumped in this site against the wishes of the community and of the protesters, although 30 years later it was cleaned up, in fact. So nationally, those born into wealthy and dominant groups have tended to enjoy the environmental goods, as we said, while the poor, such as the residents of Warren, North Carolina, and minority groups began to experience environmental bads. And on a global scale, those living in developing countries tended to get the bads, while those in the more developed countries had more of the goods. So there's a parallel going on at the global level. And for many, the global component started with such characters as Chico Mendes, who is a Brazilian rubber tapper and collector of nuts and so forth, who made a living out of the rainforest and organized a worker group to stand against logging and the clearing of forests for agricultural purposes. And he was ultimately martyred in 1988 by a cattle rancher who found him to be standing in the way of their interests. So another aspect of the environmental justice movement that sets it apart from the broader environmental movement is really an increased focus on what's going on in our bodies in terms of the environment, our health. And this environment is the zone of the body's perpetual dialogue with the environment. What's going on in our bodies is connected to what's going on in the environment around us. And so the issues that concern the dynamics of that dialogue are of importance. And those include health, food, because food is one of the primary ways we exchange materials from the environment to our body. And of course, breathing air and drinking water. But the environment, of course, is a more encompassing term than the environment, which is the boundaries are our bodies, right? So think about what you eat, where it comes from, the complexities of the global food system. There are more and more interconnections and flows. It's hard to keep track of where things are coming from and what's going into them. And that really creates a lot of uncertainty about what's going on with the food we're eating and, of course, what's happening in our bodies as a result. And pesticides, of course, are a major concern here. 71% of pesticides in use are considered at least somewhat hazardous, and there have been several studies linking them to birth defects, fertility problems, a number of neurological and mental problems, and cancer. Cancer is one of the major concerns. So not everyone, of course, can afford to buy pesticide-free food, and this has become another element of environmental injustice. Who has access to safe food now falls along racial and class lines. Organic food by many is viewed as a vanity food or positional good because it's limited in supply. It's a way for people to advertise their social status by buying organic food, because some people are better able to avoid the effects of pesticides. And so the wealthy here have a considerable advantage in terms of avoiding pesticides. And unfortunately, many of the people among those who cannot afford organic food are some of the most vulnerable. There include many children, single mothers who are pregnant or nursing perhaps, and pesticides are really most disruptive to women who are pregnant or nursing because of endocrine disruption and hormonal imbalances that result. So women in particular who have toxins in the breast milk are able to pass that on to children who can then have developmental problems. And this is a major concern in a public crisis. So as we wrap up our little discussion of environmental justice, I think it's important that we think about what the term justice actually means. And so we'll consider a couple of different philosophical approaches here and think about their implications for equity. And one of those, and perhaps the most widespread basis of justice that our country was built on, is utilitarianism. And the basic view of utilitarianism is that we should be trying to appeal to the greatest good for the greatest number of people. And on the face of that, that doesn't sound like such a bad thing. Sure, there's not a lot of resources, so let's just try to take care of as many people as we can. And not such a bad thing on the face of things, as we said. So the problem, though, is that a great deal of inequality can be tolerated within a utilitarian framework in terms of who is part of this greatest good, the greatest number. And in fact, in really a racist system, the majority are white in the United States, and so racial and ethnic minority groups may not be part of the majority. And so if we are protecting the rights of the majority, then we're not looking out for the rights of minorities. And that's the real problem. So Rawls has advanced our notions of justice beyond the utilitarian framework and argues that justice means we want the greatest good for everyone, not just the greatest number, so a broader focus. Our own good must be realized within the context of others, similarly and justly pursuing their own good. So there needs to be this notion of trade-off and compromise, right? You can advance yourself, but also think about how well others are able to advance their interests. And this does not depend on everyone being exactly equal, but it certainly has a higher level of egalitarianism in it and can offer a way to maximize fairness. The problem here, though, is it does not account for how people become more capable of achieving what they want. So we've got to pay attention more to capabilities, and that's where Amartya Sen's philosophy comes in. In fact, Sen defines poverty as capability deprivation. So people who are unable to advance their interests are considered poor. It's an interesting definition. It's not about money, although certainly one would think that resources and money would be part of those capabilities, right? So we want to maximize people's capabilities to achieve their functionings, as he put it, or their own kind of self-interests. And so when we don't have justice, it means people don't have access to pursue the things that they would like to pursue in life and their functionings, right? So the problem with this is that it's highly focused on self-interest and not on the concerns of others. And so that is where Dworkin's contribution comes in, and his notion of equality for concern. We're not just going to be worried about our own self-interest, but we're also going to be thinking about the interests of others. And so by maximizing our concern for other people, this offers the greatest opportunity for us to enhance social justice. So the responsibility of concern for others and what they value needs to come into play, right? Not just for ourselves, not just what we get out of life, our own capabilities, but the capabilities of others has to be a concern. Otherwise, the powerful could again retain the resources they need for their own capabilities and functioning. So, another way to look at this, when you have a democratic system with utilitarian philosophy, you can have this unfortunate outcome that has been referred to as the tyranny of the majority, where the dominant group simply uses democratic mechanisms to protect their own interests. And it is quite possible, and it has happened. But democracy with real justice, maybe using one of the later developments beyond utilitarianism as a basis of justice, means that everybody could have access and not just the dominant group. And it's clear that history has shown the dominant group does not necessarily willingly hand over resources and power, that a lot of times this has taken confrontation, and that's embodied in the movement, the civil rights movement, for instance. So policies that promote the capabilities of all to realize their own goals perhaps needs to be accompanied by really a cultural shift where people develop a concern for others rather than their own self-interest, and also put in place mechanisms to protect the capabilities and functionings of other people. So, of course, the real challenge there is the competition for resources, and it's hard to imagine, the powerful just simply handing over their advantages. And now we'll kind of wrap up our discussion of the environmental movement by thinking about a few themes. The first theme has to do with tactics. How do individuals working within the movement operate? What kind of tactics do they use? And we see in the second and third waves a real break from the first wave, which is, as we said earlier, really policy-driven and top-down. That the second and third waves were bottom-up movements, really everyday people sort of demanding changes. And this is modeled after the civil rights movement. And of course, the civil rights movement was modeled after the liberation of India from British rule under Gandhi, right? These kind of nonviolent, peaceful protests. And the environmental movement adopted a lot of those same techniques. And the real secret to making a social movement stick is having some kind of organizational framework created. And as we said, there were ample resources and ample people willing to work in these environmental movement organizations. And now today, some of these are worth billions of dollars. So there's a lot of resources to support the environmental movements, and financial support is, for some, the extent of their involvement. A lot of people who support environmental issues don't necessarily take to the streets themselves, but they may write checks to some of these organizations and use, at least lend their resources to keep things moving in this direction. Really in the third wave, more than the second wave, we begin to see more direct action techniques being used. Many environmentalists became dissatisfied with the kind of peaceful protest model because it seems slow and oftentimes ineffective. And as we saw with Love Canal, for instance, where there's this kind of kidnapping, we say in parentheses or quotes, it wasn't a real kidnapping, but it was more of a public, performance where officials were locked in the house of Lois Gibb, and their demands were to be met if they were to be released and so forth. It was all sort of a show to put on. And Greenpeace, with their cameras getting between the whaling ships and the whales, were able to capture on film directly what was happening and then pass that on to the media, which created widespread concern for the plight of whales. And then, of course, in the 90s in particular, we saw the rise of eco-terrorism, or these kind of forms of extreme forms of direct action taken by groups such as the Earth and Animal Liberation Front. And they engaged in such things as property destruction, where they would burn down ski resorts, for instance, in Vail, Colorado, that were built in sensitive habitats. And as the environmental movement has really depended on people, and democracy, of course, is helpful for that, the problem and the challenge is keeping people interested in participating. Oftentimes they may want to veer away, focus on other things. People become fatigued after a while, focusing on the same issue. And of course, as things become institutionalized through law and through the rise of organizations, direct involvement becomes less of a requirement, and a lot of people sort of become kind of hands-off, apathetic, and so forth. So culture is a factor here. It's not just democracy. What sort of values and norms are we putting in place? And how are we promoting a critical consciousness, which is really keeping people aware of dangers and aware of what they can do to stave off some of these particular dangers, and to be also critical of expertise, those who claim to have expertise and so forth, with regard to science and technology in particular. And we see that in such things as hydrofracking, where so-called industry experts were claiming that this practice was safe, and many in the public, of course, were quite critical of that. And so when we reflect on risk and the notion of the precautionary principle, that is something that needs to be taken seriously. Evaluating things before jumping in with both feet to make sure it's safe, and being aware that profit seeking is always going to be a motivating factor of industry, perhaps over even the safety and protection of society, right? So we need to question short-term profit-seeking motivations and really become more concerned with long-term protection of social welfare and well-being. And need to keep looking at the structural components of all this. But like all things, for democracy to work, it does take practice, and many times people are not really used to being directly involved, and at times direct involvement is important. So creating social norms of participation is going to be important to sustaining any kind of movement. And empowerment is a key here too. We want to make sure people feel like their actions matter. So we need to overcome apathy and fatalism. Fatalism is the idea that the problem is too big to do anything about it. And of course that is dangerous thinking, because then you'll throw your hands up and just sort of become withdrawn and stop trying to be a part of the solution. So realizing victories is one way to empower people, and that means tackling not the national or global level problems headlong, but really what can you do in your own backyard, something that's practical what can you do in your own community to make some kind of improvement and work towards larger scale goals as long-term rather than short-term goals. And of course, leadership is an important factor in all of this, and the real value of democracy is that there's a spirit of rotation, that we don't become too reliant on any one leader. And really, so a lot of this discussion about maintaining the environmental movement winds up being a discussion about how to make democracy work. And I think that's a good place to stop. Thank you.